Fear the Walking Dead Season 6, where did it all go wrong? Things started off so well, and then in what has now become typical Fear the Walking Dead fashion, it all quickly went to shit. I'm sure that everyone and their dog are aware of my views regarding Season 4 and 5 of Fear the Walking Dead by now, but for those of you out there who do need your memory refreshed, I hated Season 4 and 5. In fact, I didn't manage to make it to the end of either season simply because I disliked them both so much. Prior to the release of Fear the Walking Dead Season 6, it's fair to say that I did not have high expectations going into it. However, I watched the Season 6 premiere and bloody loved it. Then I watched Season 6 Episode 2, which I also liked. I watched the third episode, which was another solid installment, and then came episodes 4, 5, 6 and 7, and I liked them all as well. In fact, to my huge surprise, I liked the entirety of Season 6A, and this was reflected in the positive reviews that I put out on my channel. Yeah, I was still annoyed with all the changes made to the show since Morgan's introduction at the start of Season 4, but I was enjoying watching the show again for the first time in nearly 4 years. Morgan was no longer the annoying pacifist that had plagued the show for the last 2 seasons. In the Season 6 premiere, he brutally chops off Emil's head, something that made me gasp in shock. I mean, this was the first time since appearing on Fear the Walking Dead that Morgan directly killed someone. The awful dialogue that is present in Season 4 and 5, which many, including myself, have come to label as Gimple speak, was gone. Characters were now talking like real human beings instead of speaking in riddles and just talking absolute nonsense all the time. In addition, the original cast were actually acting like themselves again. Strand was back to being a conniving backstabber. He pushes a dude into a group of walkers to save his own skin, and then he joins Ginny's group for his own personal gain. Daniel, who had pretty much done nothing of relevance since returning to the show, was playing Ginny for a fool, pretending to have lost his memory. Alicia was no longer wasting her time painting trees. She was back to fighting walkers, back to being the pre-Season 4 Alicia who had no problems taking care of herself. Even the characters introduced after Morgan arrived on the show, who I never particularly cared about, such as Al and June, came off as much more likeable in this half of a season than they had done previously. In summary, there's a lot to like about 6A. So what the hell happened then in 6B for me to come out of yet another season of Fear the Walking Dead feeling disappointed? Well, let's examine some of the key decisions in 6B which I think had a negative effect on this season as a whole. After loving 6A, I was really excited going into 6B of Fear the Walking Dead, and then I watched episode 8 and then I just didn't want to watch the show anymore. I've made it clear numerous times on my channel that I don't really care for the majority of the characters introduced to Fear the Walking Dead since Morgan joined the show. However, John Dorie was the one exception to this rule. He was a genuinely likeable and a sweet guy, and easily the best character to appear on the show since Morgan crossed over. He was also a huge hit with the fan base. So what did the writers decide to do with this fan favourite character? Why, kill him off, of course. Now, I understand that there are some viewers out there who actually liked John's death. I mean, after all, death is a huge part of Fear the Walking Dead and The Walking Dead, and the idea that no one is safe is what keeps a lot of viewers interested in both shows. Prior to John's death on Fear the Walking Dead, we hadn't had any protagonist die since Madison 2 seasons ago, if in fact she is actually dead because the showrunners keep teasing her, but anyway, that's a story for another day. But anyway, you could certainly argue that Fear was overdue another death. However, I just can't help but feel that Fear the Walking Dead was kicking itself in the nuts by killing off one of its most likeable characters. I mean, they already did a similar thing with Nick in Season 4, and yeah, that didn't really turn out very well, did it? Okay, I understand in that example that Frank Delane, who played Nick, did want to leave, but that's still 2 huge fan favourite characters dead, 3 if we include Madison, in the space of a couple of years. It's hard to care about a show when your favourite characters keep dying. In terms of John's actual death, I hated the lead up to it, as well as the fact that his death was at the hands of Dakota, which I'll expand upon in a moment. Now, if I were to describe John Dorie, I would describe him as an optimist, and I don't think many people would take issue with my description of his character. I think it's a fair assessment that even during the apocalypse, this guy always saw the good in people, and he was a pretty positive character during the majority of his run on the show. Yet in Season 6 Episode 8, John's character completely changes. Suddenly, this guy who would do anything to be with his beloved June had now transformed into a guy who wanted to shut himself in a cabin and blow his brains out. I just think that his descent from happy optimist to full-on suicidal dude happened far too quickly. The transition just didn't work for me. In Season 6 Episode 4, John had finally reunited with his wife June, the love of his life. But now you're expecting me to believe that in the space of 4 episodes, he decided that he wanted to die. Yeah, sorry, I'm just not buying it. Yes, John and June did go their separate ways at the end of episode 6, but that wasn't because of a breakdown in their relationship. I mean, June didn't even know that John was going to run off. June just couldn't stand being at the corrupt Lawton anymore, so he drove off to be on his own. And I don't think many people watching this scene thought, oh, John's going to drive off and kill himself. I mean, and that backs up the point I'm trying to make, and that John's character change in episode 8 just didn't feel earned to me at all. The writers do try to explain away John's depression, with it seemingly stemming from the death of Janice in episode 4. However, I don't really understand why a death of a character who was essentially an extra on the show would drive John to suicide. I mean, maybe I'm forgetting something, but I don't remember these two ever being that particularly close. I'm sure there's a throwaway line in episode 4 itself where John says to Janice, "You're the closest thing I have to family," or words to that effect. However, this just feels like a cheap attempt by the writers, in my opinion, to explain away John's depression. The reason why I'm saying this is that even though John says to Janice, "You're like family to me," we're never actually shown any evidence of that being true on the show. I mean, when he said that line, I was just thinking to myself, really? You consider her family? I hardly remember you two even interacting with one another. I mean, imagine if during the upcoming final season of The Walking Dead, Negan randomly walked up to, I don't know, let's say Cindy from Oceanside, and Negan said to her, "Cindy, you're the closest thing to family I've got," and then Cindy died, and then Negan became depressed. I mean, if that happened, it wouldn't make any sense, because we know these two aren't close. I mean, I don't even think these two have ever spoken to each other or have ever been in the same scene together. And although John and Janice have had conversations with one another, the same concept still applies. I mean, do you really expect me, the viewer, to believe that these two are close based on hardly any on-screen character development or interaction just because of one lazy line of dialogue? I'm sorry, but I'm just not buying it. If Janice had been around on Fear the Walking Dead for longer, and if we as viewers had seen real evidence that her and John were really close friends, then I might have understood why he got so upset about it. But as it stands, it just feels like a cheap explanation as to why John wanted to end his life. Also, as I previously mentioned, at the end of episode 4, John is reunited with June after being separated for what I believe is a couple of months or maybe even longer, and now here John is, back with the love of his life, and I don't believe he would throw that all away and kill himself over someone who he barely knew, or who we barely even saw him talk to. Moving on, the fact that John was killed by Dakota also irritated the hell out of me. In Season 6A, Dakota was a likeable kid, something that the Walking Dead universe hasn't exactly had in abundance. I mean, most kids on Fear the Walking Dead and The Walking Dead, they annoy the life out of me. Don't even get me started on those cringy kids in Fear the Walking Dead 5A, but here in Dakota, Fear the Walking Dead finally had a likeable young adult. So of course in Season 6 Episode 8, the writers just had to pull the old switcheroo and have Dakota turn out to be a sociopathic murderer for no other reason whatsoever than just to shock the audience. And in my opinion, this is something that happens a lot in 6B. There are many narrative twists which I believe feature in the show for no other reason than just to surprise the viewers, even if said twists end up having a detrimental effect on the show. Remember those guys from the stadium in Season 4? Well, they are back and are now evil for some reason. Remember how Grace is pregnant? Well, the baby dies because, haha, bet you didn't see that coming. Oh look, it's Strand and Morgan together, but hang on. Watch out, Morgan, Strand is going to try to kill you. What an unexpected turn of events. Dumb things just keep happening in 6B without any care or thought as to how they will impact the show going forward, and they're just there, like I said, just because they want to shock you, but they don't really make a lot of sense. I mean, the fact that John found out that Dakota was the one who murdered Cameron due to her having the murder weapon on her was ridiculously dumb. I mean, why would Dakota insist on carrying around the only thing that could have possibly linked her to the crime? Anyone with half a brain cell would get rid of the murder weapon, especially seeing as she was there when John was doing his investigation into Cameron's death, and John even actually questioned her as to whether she knew Cameron and what her relationship to Cameron was. So to summarise, I believe the decision to kill John was dumb, as was the manner in which it happened. And speaking of dumb things in 6B, let's move on quickly to my next point. Prior to Season 6, the world of Fear the Walking Dead already felt extremely small. However, in 6B, it manages to feel even smaller. You'll have to excuse my poor knowledge of US geography, but The Walking Dead's Alexandria safe zone is supposed to be located somewhere in Virginia, not far from Washington, whereas Fear the Walking Dead Season 4 takes place in Texas. During Fear the Walking Dead Season 4, Morgan somehow ran from Alexandria to Texas, which according to Google Maps takes roughly 472 hours, or just over 19.5 days, and is a distance of 1,440 miles. By sheer luck, Morgan somehow bumped into the protagonist of Fear the Walking Dead when he arrived in Texas. And it's worth pointing out that Texas isn't a small place by any means. I mean, it's roughly 2.8 times the size of the United Kingdom. And by sheer luck, Morgan somehow met Nick and Alicia. I mean, bloody hell, it's only on the very rare occasion that I actually bump into people I know whilst walking around the town that I live in. I mean, that could be because everyone avoids me because they dislike me, but my point still stands. The odds of Morgan finding the Fear crew were astronomically low. Yet Morgan finds them, and then in Season 5, Dwight also somehow does the same thing, travelling from Alexandria to Texas, bumping into Morgan in a world without long-range communication devices. Now, as a TV show writer, you can maybe get away with doing this kind of thing once, or at a push maybe twice on a show, but in Season 6B, the amount of coincidental meetings just goes through the roof. Cole from Season 4 returns and just so happens to bump into Alicia, Wes just so happens to bump into his long-lost brother who he thought was dead, John Dorie's father just so happens to appear on the show shortly after his son's death, and he just so happens to have a history with Teddy, 6B main's antagonist. During the season finale, pretty much every single protagonist just so happens to avoid a nuclear blast due to sheer luck. Dwight and Sherry encounter a random couple in the woods who provide them with shelter. Strand takes cover in a building out of the blast's range, not that he knew this mind you, he thought he was going to die. John Sr. and June just so happen to find an underground bunker, and Daniel and the rest of the characters just so happen to be saved by a Civic Republic helicopter in the nick of time. It absolutely destroys any sense of immersion that the show is trying to build when these extremely unlikely scenarios just keep happening repeatedly. Fear the Walking Dead doesn't feel like it takes place in the huge US of A. Instead, it feels like it takes place in some small village that you'd see on some crappy UK soap opera. I mean, simply due to the fact that everyone keeps running into one another when realistically they shouldn't be. Morgan is one of the most frustrating characters in the history of The Walking Dead, and I won't spend too much time talking about the Morgan in Fear the Walking Dead Season 4 and 5 because I've mentioned this so many times in the past and I have discussed it at length in my video covering the fall of The Walking Dead, but anyway, here's the quick version. Morgan in Fear the Walking Dead Season 4 and 5 is unbearable. He spends 2 seasons preaching about saving people and not doing what needs to be done, often resulting in him and the protagonist ending up in situations which could have easily been avoided had they just carried out a bit of the old ultra-violence. As I've already mentioned, in the Season 6 premiere, Morgan chops off a dude's head, something that had me fist-pumping the air after having to suffer through his pacifism for the last 2 seasons. At the end of the premiere, Morgan talks to Ginny over the radio and says to her that Morgan Jones is dead and she is dealing with someone else entirely, a line which sent shivers down my spine. Finally, Morgan Jones meant fucking business. He attaches Emil's axe head to his staff and he goes on a path of revenge, killing anyone who gets in his way, and I fucking loved it. But then 6B comes along, and what a surprise. Morgan Jones, the character who has flipped between being a pacifist and a killer more times than a McDonald's employee flips burgers, flips once again, and now he doesn't want to kill people. Now he lets Riley, one of Teddy's most dangerous men, escape twice. And he even lets Teddy escape himself. Here we are yet again with Morgan letting dangerous people live, something he's been doing since all the way back in Season 5 of The Walking Dead, and that season aired 6 years ago. Why is he still doing the same shit? Why hasn't he learnt his lesson? I really thought that Morgan had turned a corner when I watched 6A, but it turns out Morgan can't turn a corner because all he does is keep going around in circles, doing the same thing in a loop forever. I'm just done with this guy. I cannot express how little I care about his character anymore, which doesn't bode well for the rest of Fear the Walking Dead when his character is always front and centre of the show. I also disliked how many times Morgan bailed out the other characters when they were in danger. I mentioned the abundance of coincidences featured on this season a moment ago, but here's some more for you. Grace is about to be killed by Ginny, and of course Morgan appears on horseback just before she pulls the trigger to save the day. Dakota is about to shoot Strand when, oh look what it is, it's Morgan with his impeccable timing again. Alicia is about to be attacked by walkers, but don't worry, look to the sky, it's Superman Morgan, here again. And yes, okay, I know this last example took place in 6A, but the point still stands. Morgan feels way overpowered on this show. No wonder this guy made short work of travelling from Virginia to Texas. I mean, I'm certain he can fly or teleport given the knack he has for arriving at the right moment. Morgan sucks in 6B, and he was a major reason why I didn't enjoy the second half of Season 6. Sometimes having limitations imposed on you can actually be a good thing, especially if you're involved with some kind of creative process. The second season of The Walking Dead had its budget slashed compared to the first season of the show, and as a result the writers had to focus more on characters rather than having a ton of lavish action sequences. Some people may dislike the second season of The Walking Dead, but personally I think it did a great job in developing characters such as Glenn, Daryl, Beth, Maggie, Herschel and Carol, characters who would all go on to become fan favourites and play important roles on the show. Due to COVID-19, Fear the Walking Dead 6A also had limitations imposed upon it, specifically relating to the amount of people on set and the approach the show had to take towards filming. There were no huge group of walkers to be seen in 6A, there were very few action sequences, and the protagonists were all split apart from one another. 6A had to be smaller in scope than Fear had been in the past. Each episode was like a mini story focused on one or two characters, and surprisingly this approach worked wonders. Fear could no longer rely on big action sequences to paper over its shoddy writing. Instead, the writing was now front and centre. These episodes would live and die depending on how well written they were and how good the dialogue was. And like I mentioned at the start of this video, the dialogue in 6A was pretty damn good. Conversations seemed more believable, and gone were the long obnoxious monologues that plagued the 5th season in particular. The stories told in 6A were all relatively simple, but that worked to the show's advantage. Season 6 episode 4 The Key was basically a murder mystery story in which John was tasked with figuring out who in Lawton had killed Cameron. It's a simple premise, but it was wonderfully executed, and the episode did a fantastic job of portraying how corrupt Lawton was under Ginny's rule. Now compare the stories in 6A to some of the stories in 6B, and it feels like you're watching an entirely different show. I mean, one minute we are watching John do some detective work in 6A, and the next our protagonists are all trying to stop nuclear warheads going off whilst navigating a submarine containing radioactive walkers. Yeah, 6A proved that less is sometimes more. By the time it came around to film 6B, Fear the Walking Dead was able to film under less restrictive COVID rules. This Instagram post from Coleman Domingo mentions that they kept going in a state that was a bit more chill when it came to COVID rules. And to be honest, when I saw this post, I began to worry for the rest of Season 6. Head writers Chambliss and Goldberg are, to put it kindly, a bit eccentric when it comes to their story ideas. I mean, Fear the Walking Dead Season 5 had the protagonist escaping an area in which a nuclear plant went into meltdown by using a makeshift plane and then landing the plane on a runway which was lit up by Christmas lights, and yeah, that's not even the worst thing to happen during that season. Simply put, when these two are given free rein to write about what they want with no restrictions, things don't normally go very well. And with some of the COVID restrictions eased during the filming of 6B, all the problems that Fear had in Season 4 and 5 began to resurface. 6B traded away the subtle small-scale storytelling of 6A for more action scenes, more walkers, more explosions, and in my opinion, as a result of this, the writing went to shit. The finale of Season 6 is bloody awful. However, I think many people ignored how little sense everything made during this episode, simply because they were distracted by all the pretty explosions and all the destruction that was taking place. It kind of reminded me of a Transformers movie. The entire thing was just incredibly dumb, and I'm at a loss as to how anyone was satisfied with how the way things ended in 6B. Fear the Walking Dead works when its writing is more subtle, when its story is more focused on smaller interpersonal issues between characters, as opposed to when its attention is focused on stopping lame cartoon villains who want to blow up the world. And speaking of lame cartoon villains, let's talk about Teddy's cult. Teddy's Doomsday Cult were always the real big bad of Fear the Walking Dead Season 6. Morgan fought and brutally killed some of their members in 6A, and there was always this feeling that Ginny and her group were just the appetizer, which would come before the real villain of Season 6. Sadly, Teddy and his group never really lived up to the hype, and all his motivations make little to no sense at all. Teddy's grand master plan involves launching some nuclear warhead so the world can begin again, or some cliche shit like that, which in my opinion is completely pointless. I mean, the world is already destroyed, there's a zombie apocalypse taking place. Does the Earth really need nuking when there's not much left of anything anyway? I mean, in effect the world has already been nuked, so why does Teddy want to nuke it again? During the episode The Holding, we are introduced to Teddy's underground self-sustaining home. In theory, he and his group could have just stayed there forever, so why did they have to get involved with fighting Morgan's group and trying to launch nukes? Now I know what you're all going to say to me in response to this. Teddy is crazy, Josh, it doesn't have to make sense. He's a cult leader, he was in prison for decades, he's lost his mind, and in fact he was already crazy way before he was imprisoned. And you know what? I agree with you on that one. Teddy is clearly insane, there's no disputing that. However, the thing that I find really disappointing is that I kind of feel like the writers solely decided on having Crazy Teddy as 6B's villain because it was an easy option and not because it was a good decision for the overall narrative. I mean, Teddy is insane, so therefore none of his actions need to be explained. Therefore, it doesn't matter if the writing is shit and the actions of his cult are dumb. They're crazy, just accept what's happening, don't question anything, just enjoy the show. I mean, perhaps I'm being a bit harsh here, but it just feels a bit cheap, and Teddy as a villain already feels very cliche to me. And the more I saw of Teddy, the less intimidating he became, to the point where I saw him as a bit of a joke by the end of the season. I felt like Teddy's group were also extremely underdeveloped. I mean, whether you love or hate the Negan saga on the Walking Dead TV show, one thing that season 7 and 8 of The Walking Dead does well is that it makes the Sanctuary feel like a real place. We learn about Negan's lieutenants, their history, what makes them tick, and we see them eventually plotting against one another. We don't know anything about anyone from Teddy's group besides from him and Riley. And as for Riley, the only thing I know about him is that he previously served on the ship which he and Teddy tried to launch the nukes from, so besides that he's pretty much a blank canvas. The only other people from Teddy's group we actually see are nameless extras during the episode The Holding, or generic henchmen who are killed. Yeah, okay, we get Wes's brother for all of about 30 minutes before he's killed, but again, he doesn't add an awful lot to the lore surrounding this group. Fear the Walking Dead just doesn't spend a significant amount of time with this cult. Teddy is never shown interacting with his followers. I mean, he's supposed to be a cult leader, but not once do we see him addressing his people. I cannot understate how much a small scene of Teddy speaking to all his followers would have added. I mean, imagine all his followers kneeling before him, reciting the end is the beginning and eating up every word he was saying to them. There's no scene showing Teddy talking directly to his people, like how Ginny spoke to the people of Lawton, or how the Ottos held meetings on their ranch with their people. Just one scene of Teddy actually acting like a leader would have made the cult feel real. Instead, the only scene on the show featuring him talking to his followers is when his ramblings are being blasted over some speakers at the Holding, to which none of the cultists seem that infused to have to listen to. Now, you could argue that perhaps Teddy is just a different type of leader to those that we've seen in the past on Fear the Walking Dead and The Walking Dead. Perhaps he delegates his commands to others, but if this is true, why don't we see any of that take place? It never feels like Teddy is actually the leader of this huge group that's been causing so many problems for people, because the only person we see him interact with from his group is Riley, and even those scenes add very little to the show. I just feel like Teddy's entire cult is wasted on the show. The whole concept was half-assed. A cult setting could have been really interesting, but it was just rushed and wasn't explored as well as it should have been. The majority of Season 6A took place in Lawton, or places that were linked to Lawton, such as Tanktown. These were all under the occupation of Ginny and her group, meaning that for the entirety of 6A, our protagonists were essentially stuck behind enemy lines. There was always tension during the episode set in Lawton because the protagonist had to be careful as Ginny and her rangers were always watching. Even during the episode where Dwight and Al were on the road, the rangers were checking up on the pair of them via the radio, meaning that they had to tread carefully. However, once Ginny died, this tension completely evaporated. Most of the episodes in 6B took place on the road or at Morgan's camp, which is apparently called Valley Town, so I can finally stop referring to it as Morgan's camp. Valley Town just isn't that interesting. It's our character's headquarters, there's little to no danger here, and it just doesn't have the same appeal as seeing the protagonists at Lawton does. Herschel's farm, the prison, Alexandria and the Otto Ranch are arguably some of the most iconic locations to feature in The Walking Dead and Fear the Walking Dead. And they all have one thing in common. The protagonists all had to fight for the right to live at these locations. Now, I am aware that some people criticise The Walking Dead as a franchise because they just see it as a story in which characters go from one location to another, and that location eventually becomes unsafe and then they move on again, and some find this dull and repetitive, and I can completely understand that. However, for me personally, some of the best moments from The Walking Dead and Fear the Walking Dead all stem from episodes in which the characters arrive at a new location and have to deal with the people that are already living there. I loved the episodes in The Walking Dead in which Rick came to blow with the inmates already living at the prison, and I also loved the episodes in which the group arrives at Alexandria. Fear's third season is fantastic because whilst the Clarks detest the Ottos, they have to work out a way in which they can all live together on their ranch. Valley Town just has none of this intrigue. Isaac leads Morgan to Valley Town in the first episode of Season 6. Morgan then makes it his mission to save his friends and bring them to Valley Town. Valley Town features 2 more times very briefly in 6A after the season premiere, and 6A is better due to the lack of focus on this location. Once the characters settle down in Valley Town in 6B, the show takes a nosedive in quality. There's just nothing interesting about this place. When Rick arrived at Alexandria, he had to learn about the people, its culture, who was in charge, and how he was going to plot his way to the top. Morgan and the rest of the protagonists don't have to do any of that because Valley Town was basically handed to him on a plate. The episodes set away from Valley Town in 6B were primarily set on the road, and they aren't much better either. 6B has this habit of characters magically appearing in different locations with no explanation as to how they got there. There are many examples in which a character ends an episode in one location, and then the next episode begins and they were somewhere else entirely, which can be rather disorientating. Yes, I understand we don't need to see hundreds of scenes showing characters driving or walking from one location to the next because it doesn't add an awful lot to the show, and you could argue that The Walking Dead actually has too many scenes of characters just aimlessly walking around in the woods, but honestly there were a lot of times watching 6B where I kind of felt like I missed an episode because characters were just suddenly somewhere else and I was just thinking, how the hell have they got there? Take the episode The Holding for example. At the beginning of the episode, Alicia, Al, Luciana and Wes walk out the elevator and into the Doomsday Cult's underground HQ. Riley then says a line of throwaway dialogue, "Oh, we rescued them from a herd," and that's it. That's all the explanation we get as to how these characters got there. I mean, it's an okay explanation I guess, but it just felt weird that one episode these characters are at Valley Town and now they're suddenly somewhere else. And perhaps the worst offender in regards to characters just jumping from one location to the next takes place in the final episode of Season 6, during the episode's opening when Rachel is on her own and her car breaks down. In the episode prior, Rachel was standing next to some of the protagonists who were watching over the submarine, yet in this episode's opening she's on her own, no explanation as to how or why. No explanation as to where she's going, she's just there on her own and then her car breaks down and she dies. Now bear in mind this woman is carrying a baby with her, so why the hell didn't any of the protagonists just accompany her? Why did they let her leave on her own when she has a baby? Why are the group not sticking together? It just makes no sense and it's never explained. Instead the writers just hope that you don't notice the bullshit writing underneath all the explosions that take place during the finale. And that last sentence just about sums up how I felt the writers approached Season 6B of Fear the Walking Dead. More bullshit writing, but hey, doesn't matter because there's more action and there's more explosions, and I guess it comes down to whether you feel that that trade-off is worth it. I mean, perhaps you don't care that the writing isn't as good in 6B as 6A because you enjoyed the action scenes, in which I say, well, good for you. Or perhaps you didn't notice a decline in the quality of writing, or perhaps you simply don't agree with my views that the writing is much worse in 6B, in which case you're obviously entitled to your opinion, but I don't agree with you. I mean, for me personally, no amount of explosions and action sequences can paper over the massive drop-off in quality of the writing that occurs in 6B. Season 6A of Fear the Walking Dead did the impossible. It made me enjoy the show again, and I say that as probably one of the show's harshest critics. However, 6B just made mistake after mistake, so much so that I find it hard to believe that the same people who wrote 6A also wrote 6B. Season 6A proved that Fear the Walking Dead can be a good show again, but 6B makes me wonder if 6A was just a fluke. A rare run of good episodes that is the filling stuck in the middle of a sandwich made up of the dire Season 4 and 5 on one side, and the awful 6B and the upcoming Season 7 on the other. I really hope I am wrong. I hope Season 7 is better than 6B, but I have my doubts. So, let me know your thoughts below. Do you agree with me? Do you agree with my take on 6B? Or, did you love that half a season? Whatever your thoughts are, let me know your thoughts below. And, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. And I'll see you all very soon. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.